Welcome to this episode of the Mad Marmot Gaming Channel. In this episode, I wanted to expand upon everything that we covered in the last episode. In the last episode, I covered a piece of software called Radeon Pro. I went through all of the features that that piece of software has to offer and explained what each of them does. And in this episode, I wanted to actually go through the process of using Radeon Pro in order to tweak a game. Now I'm going to tweak Torchlight 2 as it's not the most demanding game out there. Doing all of this stuff, working with post-processing and whatnot while you're recording can get a little tricky, so I wanted something that wasn't all that demanding. Something that's going to tweak with Radeon Pro really well so that you can see what's going on. Now I've gone through this process before. I've created a profile and then I went ahead and deleted it for the purposes of this video. So the first time I load up Torchlight 2, it's going to run with the global profile in Radeon Pro, which is basically bare bones settings. So let's go ahead and get in game, and we're going to get a feel for the game's baseline performance. Okay, so here we are in game. Before we get into all this, there's a couple side notes I want to make. First of all, I'm having a heck of a time capturing this video. I don't know if it's this game engine or whatnot. Typically I get, when recording in Fraps, roughly a 10 to 15 frame per second hit, and for some reason I'm getting like a 50 frame per second hit in Torchlight 2. It may just be the game engine, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you here and there a couple of screenshots that I'll take when I'm not recording with Fraps not running, and that will allow me to show you what kind of baseline frames I'm getting. Now again, this is using the global profile in Radeon Pro, so there's no tweaks running whatsoever. And in order to get this baseline set up properly, what we want to do is go into the settings. We want to turn on all the effects and set everything up resolution wise and all this stuff just the way we want it in the game. I've got the particle detail on high, shadow detail on high, all that stuff. I do want to run the game, if at all possible, run all your games in windowed full screen mode. There's a few exceptions. A couple game engines here or there don't like that mode, but typically, for the most part, you get better performance out of your games if you're not running in true full screen mode. This is windowed full screen mode. It's basically like a false full screen. Looks just like full screen, performs just like full screen visually, but as far as actual CPU consumption, I'm going to get a little better performance with it set up like this. Now the one thing you do want to take note of is in the settings I've got all my post-processing stuff is turned off. Anti-aliasing, vertical sync, bloom, we're going to be forcing all of this stuff either through Radeon Pro or through SweetFX. So all that stuff we want turned off. And then once we come out here, if I can get my, yeah, it looks like I cannot get my frame rate overlay to come back up. But at this point we want to take a baseline measurement to see how many frames we're running with. Now in the recording I just played, I was getting about 60 to 61 frames per second, but this here is a screenshot of just my baseline Torchlight 2 performance without any recording software running whatsoever, and you can see I'm getting 111 frames per second. Now I want you to keep in mind that the 111 frames per second is what my video card is pulling at, not my monitor. My monitor, it runs at 60 Hertz, and it is only capable of posting 60 frames per second. That is it. So that's the only thing that's actually showing up on my monitor. So the point I want to get across, and the main objective of this whole tweaking process, is going to be to get my video card to pull at a lower rate. That's going to prevent my video card from rendering a huge number of frames that are never going to be displayed to the monitor, which in turn will free up a whole bunch of processing power that my video card has to do post-processing effects instead. Now that we are back at the desktop, we are going to go ahead and click the Add Profile button. We are going to point Radeon Pro directly to the Torchlight 2 executable file. so that this profile will load up every time we actually execute the executable file for Torchlight 2 and load the game. Now we're going to go through well, first we want to make sure Torchlight 2 is selected, the profile. Now we're going to go through all these tabs and we're going to make sure that pretty much everything is unselected. We want as little running as possible for starters. So you just want to give all these tabs a good once over. Now I want to do a couple things to start. I'm going to disable arrow and I'm going to force the high priority checkbox. And I want to go and I want to make sure there's a check mark, not the blue square, but a check mark in these three boxes here to optimize those few simple processes. And now we're going to go and we're going to hit the most demanding post-processing effect first. We're going to do these basically one at a time. So for Torchlight 2, it's probably going to be anti-aliasing because it's not going to use tessellization. We're not going to really be doing anything with ambient occlusion on a game like this. So we're going to do anti-aliasing first. What we want to do is we want to go through these different anti-aliasing modes one at a time, and we're going to find out which one is going to work best for this particular game. And once we have the one that we like the most, looks the best, and runs the best, then we can go from there. Let's start with NVIDIA's sub-pixel morphological anti-aliasing. We'll set it for medium, and then we'll jump in game and see how it performs. So here is our SMAA, or the sub-pixel morphological anti-aliasing. And if you follow my mouse cursor, I'm just starting to look at some of the edges. And the edges look pretty good with this type of anti-aliasing activated. Now I'm seeing a couple jaggies here and there. I'm seeing a couple areas where shimmering's occurring, but that might just be because of two edges that almost line up. That it may do that on every mode. It's just something with this screen that I might have to put up with. I am seeing a little bit of shimmering though, but all in all this looks pretty good. Now, on the other hand, I'm down to 30 frames per second, 31 frames per second, but of course that's because I've got the recording software running, and it's going to hit my performance pretty hard. I am going to get some screenshots of each of these modes without any recording software going on, so you can see what kind of frame rates I am getting when the game's just running alone. So here is the screenshot without any recording software running. Bouncing back and forth between 69 and 70 frames, and it looks decent aside from those few shimmering issues that I've got. However, going from 111 frames all the way down to 70, that's just too big of a hit just for some anti-aliasing. It just depends on the hardware and the game engine that you're using. You're just going to have to see what works best with the specific combination that you're trying to tweak. So here we are now. We're going to turn the SMAA off, and we are going to go ahead and switch over to the FXAA, or the fast approximate anti-aliasing. We're going to put it on medium again. Okay, so here is the FXAA, or the fast approximate anti-aliasing. All in all, it looks fairly good. I think I'm seeing just slightly more jaggies on some of these edges. I've still got that shimmering effect down here. I see some more shimmering up here. All in all, it looks fairly good though, but it's still hitting my performance roughly the same, at least with the recording software going on. We'll have to check the screenshot without the recording software to see how that works without it. So here is my FXAA screenshot without any recording software, and I'm getting 89-90 frames per second, which is a lot closer to the frame rate loss that I want just for plain anti-aliasing. On the other hand, it didn't look as good as the MSAA, so we're just going to have to go and check out the other two anti-aliasing schemes that we've got left, and we'll see which one looks best. Back at the desktop, we're going to turn FXAA off, we're going to turn MLAA on, and we wanted about 4x for my specific hardware setup. Okay, so this is the MLAA, or the morphological anti-aliasing, and this looks very nice indeed. And I'm actually down to almost no shimmering down here. I see basically none over here. And you can see even with the recording software, I'm running at 60 frames per second now. We'll check the screenshot to see what I'm getting without the recording software going on. But so far, I think this is the best looking as well as the best performing anti-aliasing scheme that we've got so far. So here's our MLAA screenshot. Without the recording software, I'm running at 96 frames per second, which, coming down from the original 111 frames without any anti-aliasing, I'm only losing 15 frames. Given the fact that this thing looks so good with the MLAA turned on, this is probably what we're going to go with. But just to be thorough, we're going to go back to the desktop and we're going to flip over to that full screen anti-aliasing, and we're going to give that a try. I'm going to run the full screen anti-aliasing at 4x again. And finally, we've got your regular old-fashioned FSAA, or full screen anti-aliasing. It still looks fairly nice, although I don't see much shimmering up here as I was in some of the previous schemes, but I do see some shimmering over here again. And whatnot. Now, it is performing fairly well. I'm reading 59 to 60 frames while the recording software is going on. And once again, I'm going to flip over here to a screenshot and show you what it is without. You know, it just depends on your hardware, the video card you're running, the video card drivers, and the version of those drivers, not to mention the game engine that you are running at any particular time, as to which anti-aliasing scheme you're going to want to use, which one looks best, which one runs best. And here we are with the final screenshot. This is full screen anti-aliasing with no recording software running. I'm running at that same 95, 96-ish frames per second, so I'm not really losing any more performance over the MLAA, but I do think the MLAA looked a little better, had a little less shimmering. So I'm going to drop back to my desktop and I'm going to turn that back on. That's the anti-aliasing I'm going to go with. So back at the desktop, I'm going to go ahead, like I said, and turn the MLAA back on. And now that we are done fooling around with the 4 different schemes for anti-aliasing, we can start to get a little fast and loose with this, because other than ambient occlusion, which has a couple settings depending on your hardware, and I always use horizon-based with my specific hardware, there's really no other, different settings per scheme to use. So you start to get fast and loose and turning some things on, and then we're going to jump in here and check our performance to make sure we haven't hit anything too hard. And the tweaks here we're going to leave alone for the time being. That's going to be the last thing we do other than sweet effects. So here we are back in game. I have my MLAA back on 4x, and all the other schemes for anti-aliasing are turned off. I have my horizon-based ambient occlusion is turned on. It's set for low, but really ambient occlusion isn't going to do much for a game like this. Of course, other games are going to be a different story, especially DirectX 10 and 11 games. I have anisotropic filtering set at 8x. I've got my texture filtering set at high quality. Mip-map quality is turned up, although again on a bird's eye view game like this, mip-mapping isn't going to be nearly as important as something like Skyrim or something of that sort. I've got my texture LOD turned up, and I've got my flip queue turned all the way to maximum. And even with the recording software running, I'm still running at, it's not solid locked at 60 frames per second, but it is at 60 frames per second most of the time. So, I would be, with this setup alone, although we're not quite done yet, I'd be ready to do Let's Play. I could record, so on and so forth. But let's go ahead and see what it is doing without the recording software running. So here's my screenshot with no recording software running and all these effects turned on, and I'm still getting 92 frames per second. And as I mentioned all the way back at the beginning of the video, my monitor runs at 60 Hertz, so 60 frames is all that I can do. So I've got 50% more frames being pulled by my video card than my monitor can even handle. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep stacking post-processing effects on until I get just above 60 frames, and then I'm going to put on VSync to actually lock it at 60 frames, or I'm going to stack on a huge amount of post-processing effects, and I'm going to bring it down so it's just above 30 frames, and then I can put double VSync on and lock it at 30 frames per second. And on some games, this being one of them, I just happen to know beforehand, the VSync and the double VSync as forced by Radeon Pro don't work, but I can use the dynamic frame rate locking to get rid of screen tearing and whatnot. That's what I'm going to end up doing. So at this point, I want to go back to my desktop, and what we're going to do is we're going to turn on a whole bunch of SweetFX, and then we're going to take one last screenshot to see what kind of frame rate we're getting, and at that point we'll know what to do as far as VSync goes. If even after the SweetFX I still can't get my frame rate down close to either 30 or 60, depending on how I'm feeling any given day, what I can do is I can go back and I can kick up the anti-aliasing from 4x to 8x or 16x. I can go ahead and turn my ambient occlusion from low settings to high or medium or whatever. Back at the desktop again, we are going to leave the Tweaks tab alone for the time being. We're going to enable SweetFX, and we're going to go in here and give it, let's say cartoon. We definitely want a bloom and an HDR. What else we want to give it? Let's give it, let's put a vibrance, which is saturation, and tone map, and we'll give it a vignette and curves, which is the contrast. Okay, so we are back in game after our SweetFX configuration. Now, I started the video with SweetFX off just so we can see. This is what we started with in the last in-game video that I had played. And then SweetFX has a key that you can configure so that you can toggle these things on and off. So one key will turn all the SweetFX effects that I've keyed in on or off. This is off, and then I'm going to slap the key. This is with SweetFX on. So that's on, off, off. And you can see that even with the recording software, I'm still running it at 30 frames per second. So I'm, any kind of video that you're going to record is going to be, when it plays back, it's going to be 30 frames. So I'm good to go for a Let's Play, even with all this stuff that I've got on here right now. Now, as far as the effects I've got going, there's, you're just going to have to look at the web page for SweetFX and get a feel for what each of these does. But of course, I've got vibrance and curves, which is going to be color saturation and contrast respectively. And there are settings, so you can go in there and you can tweak each individual thing up or down if you want. I've got the cartoon setting that I turned on was, it's going to put this black outline around it, everything. It's kind of like a stroke effect. Borderlands has that by default, so that's kind of what that is. A neat little effect that you can put in there. But all in all, we're definitely starting to look a lot better. Now, the only thing that I don't like about that cartoon effect, actually, is that it's putting that stroke around the text in these buttons and inside these little pop-up windows that come up. I don't know if I like that or not. I might turn that off for this game, but I'm going to leave it on for the time being until I have a chance to actually get in game to fool around with it, see if I actually like it or not. But once again, SweetFX, no SweetFX. Big difference. So here we are with one final screenshot without the recording software running, and with the current SweetFX setup that I've got, I have whittled the frames per second that my video card's pulling at all the way down to about 63 frames per second, and I think that's right about where I want it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to lock the frame rate at 60 frames per second. With the with Torchlight 2, I'm going to have to use the dynamic frame rate locking. I'll show you that in just a second. But it's basically going to do the exact same thing as a regular old VSync. And that will lock my frames per second that my video card is pulling at 60 frames per second, which is precisely the number that the maximum amount of frames that my monitor can pull at. So my video card and my monitor will be pulling at exactly the same rate, their maximum, and I will have the screen looking as good as it possibly can look, and I'll have my video card wasting no processing power whatsoever, rendering screens that'll never actually show up on my monitor. Okay, so we have, given that last screenshot, we've got the game running at 63 frames per second. We're going to go ahead and sacrifice those 3 frames and get it down to 60. Now normally I'd use VSync control, but with Team Fortress, with Torchlight 2, the VSync control as forced through Radeon Pro does not work. So instead, we're going to assign our refresh rate for our monitor at 60 frames or 60 hertz, and then I'm going to use this dynamic frame rate control. And now when I launch Torchlight 2, it will run at a solid locked 60 frames per second. And we're pretty much done with our tweak. So I figured I'd end out this video with a couple seconds of in-game footage with all the tweaks in place. A few final comments. It is extremely important, and I cannot stress enough, that you most certainly want, unless you have a monitor that refreshes at higher than 60 hertz, you want to keep your frames at 60 or lower, so that you're not wasting your GPU power rendering frames that are never going to get posted to the monitor in the first place. You definitely want to go all out with post-processing effects and get each of the frames that are going to get posted to the monitor looking as good as they possibly can. It definitely makes the game a lot more enjoyable as you play through it. So I hope these few minutes you've spent watching this video have helped you out. You should be at this point able to tweak out just about any DirectX game or Direct 3D game with Radeon Pro. I wish you luck and happy tweaking.